All right, let's get right into it. We're going to break down the really complex, far-reaching impact of sanctions on Iran. We're talking about how a foreign policy tool, something that sounds so abstract, can end up reshaping an entire country's economy and, more importantly, the day-to-day lives of its people.
So let's just start with a number that'll make you stop and think. 171%. That's how much healthcare costs jumped for the average Iranian after heavy sanctions were put back in place in 2018. It's a massive figure, and it immediately begs a really important question.
Right. How does a decision made thousands of miles away in a government building lead directly to someone struggling to afford basic medicine? Well, to figure that out, we first need to get a handle on what these measures actually are and how they work. To really get what's going on, we have to start with the terminology. And the most important word to understand here is unilateral. You see, these aren't sanctions that the whole world, through the UN Security Council, has agreed upon. No. Unilateral sanctions are when one single country decides to put economic pressure on another. And that's a huge distinction because it leads to two very different kinds of sanctions. And this is where it gets really interesting. Primary sanctions are pretty simple. A country tells its own citizens and companies they can't do business with a target country. But secondary sanctions, that's where the ripple effect goes global. It's one country telling companies all over the world, in Europe, in Asia, hey, if you do business with Iran, we might just cut you off from our entire financial system.
And that threat creates this massive chilling effect. The risk of getting hit with those penalties is just so huge that international banks, shipping companies, you name it, they often decide it's easier to just avoid Iran altogether. Even for things that are supposed to be exempt like food and medicine, they overcomply because honestly, it's just not worth the risk.
So what's the result of all this? Well, you get a major economic squeeze. And make no mistake, this is the intended impact, to put very real, very direct pressure on Iran's economy at the national level.
And wow, the numbers really do tell the story. The hit is immediate, and it is severe. Think about it. Oil is the lifeblood of Iran's economy. Sanctions from just the EU and Japan cut those exports by more than half. Total imports fall by a fifth. These aren't just little dips. These are major economic shocks that send tremors through the entire system.
This chart just paints such a clear picture. You don't even need to be an economist to see it. Look at those sharp drops in the line. Those are economic contractions. And guess what? They line up perfectly with periods when heavy sanctions were in place. You can see these roller coaster cycles of boom and bust, and they're tied directly to international policy.
But you know, these big economic numbers, they only tell half the story. Because all that pressure on the state's economy, it doesn't just stay at the top. It trickles down, and that's where you see the incredible human toll.
Some research has actually tried to quantify this, estimating that international sanctions have cut the total welfare of Iranians by about 15%. And just to be clear, welfare isn't some abstract idea here. It means a real, tangible drop in the quality of life for millions of people. And this is what that drop feels like for a family trying to make ends meet. Since 2018, the cost of food has more than doubled, and, like we saw at the very beginning, healthcare costs have just skyrocketed. This is the reality on the ground, making the absolute basics of life incredibly hard to afford. And this quote from an Iranian health policy expert really shows the impossible choices people are facing. When crucial imported medicines become too expensive or just plain unavailable because of banking issues, the healthcare system has no choice but to start rationing, to look for cheaper, sometimes less effective alternatives.
So with all of this happening, this devastating human impact, a huge question has come to the forefront of international debate. Is any of this even legal? And that question has created a major legal standoff. So back in 2018, Iran actually tried to fight this in the World Court. They argued that the sanctions went against a friendship and trade treaty they'd signed with the U.S. all the way back in 1955. But in response, the U.S. just pulled out of the treaty entirely, which basically shut that legal avenue down.
So it really boils down to this fundamental clash of principles. On one side, you have the U.S. arguing it has the right to act to protect its own national security. But on the other side, you have many in the international community saying these actions trample on the core ideas of international law, like state sovereignty and the whole point of the UN, which is for countries to act collectively, not alone.
Which leaves us all with this incredibly tough question. The stated goal is always to apply political pressure on a government. But when you see the evidence, and the heaviest burden clearly falls on ordinary people, on their health, on their welfare, you have to ask, at what point does pressure cross the line and become collective punishment? It's a question with no easy answers, and it's at the very heart of this debate.